I'm Ruebusch, and if you are interested in the finer points of face punching, you've come to the right place. This is Heavy Hands. Hello and welcome to another episode of Heavy Hands. I'm your host, Ruebusch, joined once again by Dr. Patrick Wyman, my intrepid co-host, and today we're having the second of our big UFC Fight Week shows. We've got a lot of great fights to discuss today. First up on the docket, Joanna Jedrzejczyk versus Gadelha 2. After that, we will also be discussing Aldo versus Frankie Edgar 2. Will Brooks' UFC debut against Pearson, and Choi versus Tavares. So we have a lot of great fights. This is mostly covering, aside from Aldo versus Edgar, mostly covering the second event of our 3-event weekend, which is just around the corner now. I couldn't be more excited. Pat, you and I both have a hell of a lot of work to do, but I'm really looking forward to sitting down and enjoying some fights at the end of it all.
Yeah, well, I will not be watching a single one of these events live.
Your life is a living hell.
Yeah, I'm not. I'm very happy to be spending the weekend going to what promises to be a lovely wedding in West Yellowstone. But I'm a little bummed that I'm going to miss. That I will have written 10 articles and done 2 podcasts, and will not get to watch a single one of these cards live.
I will watch these cards so hard for you, Pat. I will intensify my watching process just for your sake.
Let's see if we can make our terminology for describing that even more awkward and sexualized too. just if we can sneak it in there.
I'm gonna get deep into these events, Pat. I just want you to know that.
All up in them guts.
Jesus. So why don't we jump into our first fight? This is one I have been looking forward to for so long. Easily one of my most anticipated fights of the whole year. Ever since their first fight, I think both Joanna Jedrzejczyk and Gadelha have gotten markedly better. Most people who scored that fight thought Gadelha won, though I think it's pretty clearly Jedrzejczyk win the first 2 rounds. But it was definitely a close fight. Gadelha has sharpened up her striking, and I think her overall strategic thinking since that fight. Joanna Jedrzejczyk has sharpened up her counter wrestling, and also, I think her combination striking, and I think she might be comfortable enough to throw some kicks this time. So the matchup that was already a great competitive fight between clearly the 2 best fighters in this division has evolved and matured in a very pleasing way. I'm really excited to see these 2 ladies go at it again. Pat, why don't you give us your overall thoughts on this fight?
Yeah, I mean, I think you hit on some of the high points there. I think this is, from a pure matchup perspective, one of the best and highest level fights that you're going to see in any division in the UFC, where like Jedrzejczyk and Gadelha are just so clearly at this point the 2 best fighters in that division.
Yeah.
They're both getting better. They're both in their absolute primes. They're both still pretty young. They're making substantial leaps from fight to fight, and they just match up with each other in really interesting and compelling ways. You know, like Gadelha can compete with Jedrzejczyk in the striking. Jedrzejczyk is an excellent counter wrestler and clinch fighter, areas where Gadelha is the strongest. And even when Gadelha managed to get dominant position in their first fight, it wasn't like a blowout at that point. Jedrzejczyk knows enough to know how to defend, how to get back to her feet. The rematch is even more compelling than the first one because it's going to go 5 rounds. At least it's scheduled for 5 rounds. Mm-hmm. And I think Jedrzejczyk has proven herself over the last few fights to be a 5-round fighter. So that adds yet another dimension to what was already a compelling fight.
Yeah, why don't we go ahead and talk about defensive wrestling? It's kind of one of my articles coming out this week is focusing on the new school of sprawl and brawl, a term which really does not do justice to the fighters that use that style, like Joanna Jedrzejczyk, like Jose Aldo, fighters who specialize in restricting the fight to stand up against opponents who more often than not really, really want to take them down. It's a new style, though. It's really evolved since the days of Chuck Liddell and Rampage Jackson and Mirko Cro Cop and guys like that. I think fighters who excel in stopping takedowns and forcing a kickboxing match on their opponents are doing it with just so many more layers than their predecessors. So I want to talk about that first. What makes Joanna Jedrzejczyk's sprawl and brawl game, if we do want to call it that, what makes it particularly special? Because personally, I think she's one of the finest examples of that approach in the sport right now.
Well, it's not just that she stuffs takedowns, it's that she makes you pay for having shot the takedown in the first place. I think that is the single thing that separates the new generation of takedown defense from the older generation of takedown defense. It's that you have the confidence to know once you've stuffed the shot, now I have this position for this moment, and I can sneak in these 2 or 3 shots there to remind my opponent, to condition them that having shot for that takedown was a bad idea, that it didn't just cost them energy, they also had to pay for it, you know?
Yeah. I think in boxing you hear a lot that you don't just make your opponent miss, you make them pay. I think that is doubly important for a sprawl and brawler in MMA, because in this sport where your opponent has so many options, so many different ways to adjust to what you're showing them, you need to be able to one by one take those options away from them, which doesn't just mean take away their strikes, then take away their takedowns. It means take away each kind of strike, take away each kind of takedown, every adjustment they make, find a way to take it away from them and punish them for doing it. I think the most brilliant thing is that expert sprawl and brawlers like Joanna, they bring the kickboxing into the grappling world. So every time an opponent makes an attempt to, I need to wrestle with this striker, they realize that wrestling them is striking them too. There is no way for them to impose their game without having to deal with their striking. With Jedrzejczyk, it's particularly the elbows, sometimes the knees, but her elbows have really been her big weapon in close. In a way that Jose Aldo does not use. Jose Aldo's game is a little different, and we'll talk about that later. But Jedrzejczyk, with her framing and her elbows, the angles she takes, she stops takedowns. So she just takes away your initial drive, creates space, and then just cracks you in the chin. That upward elbow she stunned Carla Esparza with, the horizontal elbow she rocked Jessica Penne with and tore open her nose, the short little elbow she swelled up Valerie Letourneau's eye with in the clinch. Those weapons are so valuable for her against opponents who want to close the distance. She really is a monster in the clinch and when fighting from the sprawl.
Yeah, well, so you hit on something really important there, and that is that not just that she brings the striking into the wrestling, it's also that the same footwork that makes Jedrzejczyk so good and so efficient at range is also her first line of defense against takedowns, right? And we've talked about this with Jose Aldo in the past too, but probably not for years. I don't think we've talked about Jose Aldo's takedown defense since one of our very first episodes together, believe it or not.
Sounds about right, yeah.
So this holds true for Aldo as well, that having that good, tight, efficient footwork, that really good, clean movement, those nice tight pivots, the ability to take really sharp angles makes it almost impossible to get a clean shot at his hips in the first place. And this also holds true for Jedrzejczyk. So if you take a nice tight pivot as your opponent is shooting on you, that means that suddenly the hip that was right there for them to grab a hold of on a double leg is not there anymore. So they're left grasping at that second hip. Maybe they can switch it to a single, but if they switch it to a single, you're already ready with the head pressure for it. It's the old school term for this style of takedown defense was called feeding the single leg. Because those pivots mean that your back leg is almost always going to be out of range for it. Junior Dos Santos used to feed the single leg. BJ Penn was the pioneer of this particular style of takedown defense. But now when you combine that with just having incredible technical skill to start with, the control of distance, which both Aldo and Jedrzejczyk have, and the ability to punish your opponent for it, what you end up with is a brand of takedown defense that is fundamentally different than what's come before it.
Yeah, well, so one of the basic counters to this kind of takedown defense, we will talk about this when we get to Frankie Edgar in a moment. But we can talk about it now with Claudia Gadelha. It's something we also saw in the Miesha Tate versus Holly Holm fight, is when the fighter will use the leg attack to set up a waist cinch or a body lock takedown to get around the fact that the legs are kind of being baited and then taken away. They will work to the upper body, and I think that's one of Gadelha's biggest advantages in this fight, is that she's a very strong clinch fighter, very good upper body takedowns. In addition to her leg attacks, she's not going to be limited like Esparza kind of was to having to shoot at Jedrzejczyk's legs and over being denied that double leg takedown. She may not be quite the chain wrestler that Esparza is. She may not have quite as many layers, but she's a lot more physically strong, and she's very good with her double underhooks and her waist cinch positions at just lifting and slamming fighters to the ground.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really good point. I hadn't actually thought about that, but you're right that that is the best counter to to that style of takedown
Edgar did
defense.
it to Aldo in their first fight, and Misha Tate did it when she finished Holly Holm. Is when you basically you go the opposite direction and you'll go around the back instead of chasing that leg that's being pulled away from you, and you end up getting both hips just basically right in your lap.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. I think what has changed since their first fight, when Gadelha did a lot of exactly that, when that was how she had her biggest success with those kind of takedowns, is how much physically stronger Jedrzejczyk is than she was in December of 2014. Like it was clear between that fight and the Esparza fight how much she worked on her strength and conditioning, and how much bigger she got. Like I would guess that Jedrzejczyk has put on 8 or 10 pounds of muscle
Really,
since
I
their
haven't
first
really
fight.
noticed. I haven't taken
Yeah.
a close
Oh,
look
she
at
is
her
substantially larger.
her
Yeah.
physique changing.
Yeah, no, she's substantially bigger. And so you notice when she gets in positions, like that's why she's so much more comfortable framing now than she used to be. Because she's bigger, she's stronger, she knows that she can hold those positions.
Mm-hmm.
Now, whether that's going to be enough or not against Gadelha is another story, because there is nobody stronger in those kinds of grappling and clinch exchanges in this division, I don't think, than Gadelha. I
Sure.
mean, maybe no, I don't think there's anybody.
Not really.
I'll stand by that. I don't think there's a single fighter who's stronger in those exchanges.
That's the thing, though. That the advantage of Joanna's style is that you don't need to be the better wrestler. You don't need to be, though. Sometimes when you do this long enough, you kind of become the better wrestler. The crazy thing that guys like Jose Aldo will straight up out wrestle guys like Chad Mendez is bananas. But when you take this tack, all you need to do is introduce your specialty into theirs. Striking is a wonderful specialty for fighters to have because it fits into everything. You can strike when you grapple. You can strike when you're wrestling in the clinch. You can strike on the ground. You can strike while standing. You can strike at every range in a way that you can't with some of the other phases, if we call them that. And so for Jedrzejczyk, I think it's really to her advantage that even if Gadelha is, and she is, the better wrestler and the better grappler, Jedrzejczyk can introduce strikes and make it not a pure grappling contest. As long as she can make it something where no matter where Gadelha is, she has to contend with Jedrzejczyk striking, then I think that really changes the tone of those grappling exchanges.
Yeah, I fundamentally agree with that. And I mean, I think just kind of on a general note, this fight is going to be won or lost in the clinch for both fighters.
Sure.
That
Yeah.
if Gadelha can use those body locks to get the fight to the ground, especially against the fence, I think she has to control the center of the cage here. Like, I don't think that Gadelha can win this fight if it is purely an open space matchup. Like, I think she has to pressure and has to get Jedrzejczyk's back to the fence, just because while Gadelha has good footwork and is a good pocket fighter and is good at counters and all of that, if the fight goes for round after round after round after round of that, she's going to lose more of those exchanges than she wins. So if she does not do anything to minimize Jedrzejczyk's opportunities to do that, if she doesn't pressure and push her back, then I think she's going to be in trouble. But she's got smart coaches. She knows what she has to do. I would imagine that she's going to come right off the bat and try and push Jedrzejczyk back. So yeah, I mean that's kind of my read on the fight. Like, what do you think, Connor? Who do you think wins this?
Well, I think it would be a mistake to overlook the fact that Jedrzejczyk, I say the fact, it does feel like a fact, though, that Jedrzejczyk is better suited to a 5-round contest than Claudia Gadelha. I think that's a big narrative going into this fight, is that Gadelha, and I don't want to be like blase Joe Rogan-esque and just say, oh, she's muscular so she gets tired, but there's something with Gadelha, like Amanda Nunes, who's fighting on UFC 200. She's just not cut out to do the same thing she does in round 1 in rounds 3, 4, and 5. She pretty much got outstruck in the third round of her fight with Jessica Aguilar, which is not a great look. Jessica Aguilar is a tough, well-rounded fighter, and she adapts really well. She's got a bit of that Misha Tate thing going on. But Gadelha went from completely dominating her on the feet to really having trouble with her, in large part due to the fact that her volume just went down and down and down, and she wasn't as quick and spry on her feet. She wasn't packing as much power in her punches, so Aguilar didn't have to respect them as much. I think that Gadelha will almost certainly have some really strong moments at the start of this fight, and then start to fade as Jedrzejczyk makes her work in the clinch, I would definitely be more surprised to see Jedrzejczyk tired by the fourth round than I would Gadelha.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is a good way of kind of looking at the overall dynamic. Is that Jedrzejczyk has energy to burn in this fight, and Gadelha does not have energy to burn.
Yeah,
and so Gadelha has built for herself a style that is energy intensive early, but that's pretty efficient in its broad strokes. Like, she doesn't waste a lot of energy. She fights similarly to the way that Hannah Barrow and Jose Aldo do, who are her teammates, and it makes sense. And she has Andre and her head coach.
She's no Travis Brown. She doesn't go out there just throwing completely stupid, reckless things. She's very efficient. She's fairly calm. She does basic meat and potato stuff. I just think she, like we've seen with guys like Aldo, I think she just can't quite keep the same clip going against a person who really pushes the pace.
Well, she's a burst fighter, I would say.
Yeah,
I think that a lot of what she does in the fight is designed to conserve her energy. So she throws a lot of dipping jabs. She does a lot of things that don't take a lot of energy for long periods
just
of
things
time.
that, like, if you come in too hard, you'll run into them and think twice the next time.
Yeah, she uses her takedowns as a change, mostly at this stage, against opponents who are good enough to not get submitted by her, which is almost everybody who's elite in these divisions. Like, she uses that mostly to catch a breath. That she takes you down, she gets on top, she controls, and she catches her breath, and then when she has to, she can go back to striking, knowing that she's replenished her gas tank.
Have you seen any? Did you see any drastic changes in her striking game in that Aguilar fight? I thought she did look a lot more comfortable on the feet, if nothing else.
I thought she looked a lot sharper, especially with her counters, and especially in the pocket.
Counter left hooks were really on point. I think those things will be really valuable against Jedrzejczyk. But the thing is I just think Jedrzejczyk's a better adjuster. I look at Claudia Gadelha and I see a fighter who kind of comes in with the idea of what she wants to do, and she does that thing. And she does it very well, and she's an excellent fighter, and that is not at all an insult to her. There have been a lot of great fighters who have that kind of mentality. Like John Jones is that way. He can adapt, but he's much better when he's prepared for you, as we saw in the OSP fight. But I think that Jedrzejczyk can be surprised and still, by the fifth round, have built for herself a dominant fight. We saw that in the Letourneau fight. I think Letourneau had her really caught off guard when she shot for a takedown really early in the first round, countered one of those leg kicks, and by the end of that fight, there was no question who was controlling the action, even though she had two pretty tough rounds.
Well, that's just because if you can't do that over and over, right? And this was what I was trying to get at earlier with minimizing the striking exchanges. Like, Gadelha can't not strike with Jedrzejczyk, but she also can't have fallen so in love with her striking that she misses opportunities to get into the clinch and work takedowns.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, you strike with Jedrzejczyk, but you only strike in order to get to the places that you have to get. You can't run straight forward the way that Carla Esparza did to try to take her down or try to get into the clinch, but at the same time you can't consent to having a striking match with her.
Sure.
And so I favor Jedrzejczyk because I think that's a really, really difficult line to walk.
Yeah.
And I think it's one that Gadelha walked well for 3 rounds in their first fight. I think it's a much harder one to walk for 5 rounds against a Jedrzejczyk who pushes a quicker pace now than she did then, who's a better defender of takedowns now than she was in 2014,
yeah.
And who, if anything, is a more devastating combination striker and who can exploit, I would say, I would call Gadelha's kind of static defense in the pocket. Like, Gadelha is down to exchange and she's down to counter, but she's kind of rote about the way that she does that.
Absolutely. She's more Hannah Barrow than she is Jose Aldo, for sure. She's much more happy to put her hands up and try and catch something, and that's why she got caught with that uppercut in the first fight. Jedrzejczyk has a very subtle understanding of rhythm and feinting and just finding ways to, once she keys in on a reaction, she's very, very good at finding ways to work around that and use it to her advantage. I've made the comparison several times already, and I'll probably call back this fight while we're discussing it next, but I think this fight does share in common a lot of the dynamics of Jose Aldo versus Frankie Edgar, and I'm reminded of their first fight, where Frankie walked a very narrow line, where he did just enough to actively win some of the rounds without kind of invoking Jose Aldo's wrath too much. And I think Jedrzejczyk has that same kind of thing where when pushed, she becomes a pretty vicious retaliatory fighter. She's a much less forgiving fighter than she was the first time she fought Gadelha, whether it's defending takedowns or countering strikes. She tends to come back hard, and she tends to very quickly find ways to punish you for having any amount of success against her. So basically what happens is Gadelha can, probably using a more aggressive grappling approach than Edgar did against Aldo, but in the same way she can neutralize Jedrzejczyk and then kind of lose the rounds because Jedrzejczyk is fighting off the takedowns and hitting her, or she can come after her, really enhance her chances of doing damage, but also enhance her chances of being hurt. And I think either way, it kind of takes something special, something unexpected happening for Gadelha to get a win out of either of those approaches. So I too like Jedrzejczyk. I wouldn't be shocked to see Gadelha win, but I do think that Jedrzejczyk kind of has her number, especially in a 25-minute contest.
This feels a lot like one of those there are levels to this shit fights where like because I think you hit the dynamic perfectly, right? And so especially in a 5-round fight, if you're Claudia Gadelha and Andre Pederneiras is coaching you, you're not going to come out great balls of fire, because when have we ever seen an Andre Pederneiras fighter come out in a 5-round fight great balls of fire?
Sure.
Right? I mean this seriously, literally never. That is not how he coaches his guys to fight in a 5-round fight. He coaches them to come out measured and conserve their gas and only fight hard in bursts as absolutely necessary. Because he knows that he trains big, strong fighters who do not cut weight in the most efficient way possible, and who have generally not been on the best diets, especially guys like Barao, and so they don't have gas to burn in the ways that other guys do, even who cut similar amounts of weight to get down there. They are working within a particular set of constraints that other fighters aren't necessarily, and Pederneiras coaches his fighters within those constraints. So that means that I think your analysis of the idea that like she's going to do a lot of fighting measured and coming out just a little bit worse in those exchanges should play out.
Yeah, like she's going to have to fight in a way, unless she plays a really big gambit and comes after Jedrzejczyk early, because Gadelha might actually be the harder hitter in this matchup. She's very powerful, and Jedrzejczyk is not a huge power puncher. She's a snappy hitter, but it's more attrition. So she could do that, but like you said, that's not a thing Dede Pederneiras' fighters tend to do. And so if she comes out measured and she does her version of what Frankie Edgar did to Jose Aldo, it's going to be a fight that a lot of people will remember as very close, kind of like their first one, except with 2 likely less impressive rounds on Gadelha's part. But a fight which was, like Aldo Edgar 1, in reality closer to 49-46, or closer to 50-44-45 for the winner than it was to 48-47 for the loser.
Okay, I'm going to complicate our narrative real quick, because I just came up with a pretty strong exception to the Pederneiras' fighters don't come out hot narrative.
Yeah.
And that's Barao Dillashaw 2, where Barao came out just ready to chew up steel and spit it back out.
Sure. Well, in a rematch, and that actually may play a key. Also, I would not be surprised if we may have shot ourselves in the foot with that remark, because I wouldn't be surprised if Jose Aldo did something similar to Frankie Edgar.
Yeah, actually. So, well, shit. Well, shit, Connor. So, but at least we caught that before the end of our segment here, and we can now render useless much of what we just said over the last 4 or 5 minutes.
We don't have to renege too hard after the break. So, both of us like Jedrzejczyk. We have alluded to it many times already. So let's take a quick break. When we come back, let's talk about the rematch between Jose Aldo and Frankie Edgar for the interim featherweight title. Hey everybody, thanks for listening to this week's Heavy Hands. If you like what you hear, please consider pledging to support the podcast on Patreon. Patreon is basically continuous crowdfunding. You sign up to contribute a certain amount per month to help us with production costs and the like, and in return you get rewards ranging from a mention on the Heavy Hands website to a question or topic of your choice being discussed on the show. We have a lot more in the works to reward you for your help, and we appreciate every contribution. No amount is too small. Just head over to patreon.com and find how you can help out, the only show dedicated to the finer points of face punching. Now let's get back to it. And we are back. Jose Aldo, Frankie Edgar, somewhat laughably, a fight which is for the interim featherweight title. I don't say that because Conor McGregor didn't deserve to get the belt, but I do find it strange that our featherweight champion is now taking his second fight at welterweight in the space of a year. Definitely looking forward to the rematch, but it does feel kind of weird that these two guys, who are definitely in a number one contenders fight, may not end up fighting the champion.
Well, Conor McGregor is tilting at windmills. He is Don Quixote tilting at Nate Diaz and George St. Pierre and any other fight that is going to pay him shitloads of money. And you know what? Like, Conor McGregor at this point is playing a fundamentally different game in a different sport than Jose Aldo and Frankie Edgar.
Oh yeah, no doubt about that.
Like,
which is why it upsets them so much that what he's doing. Like, I can understand, and I would be upset if I were them as well. But like, I don't think they can grasp how different the career of Conor McGregor is right now to the career of pretty much everyone else in the game.
Yeah, I mean, I think Jose Aldo would like to be fighting in that sport as opposed to this one, but sure. I don't think, he just does not have what it takes to be doing that. Like, we're just talking about orders of magnitude of difference. So instead, we get a pretty damn good fight in this sport, which is one that I'm also happy to watch in addition to the Conor McGregor show.
I consider myself an MMA fan.
Yeah. You think so, Conor?
Yeah, I like it. I can watch it every now and then.
Yeah, sure. It's fun. It's a fun sport. And so, I'm really excited about this fight. I'll say this. You hit upon this a little bit earlier, Conor, but in people's memories, this fight has become closer than it actually was.
Yeah, well, I think even at the time, Frankie Edgar has a lot of diehard fans who back him every single time he has a close fight. And because he's Frankie Edgar, he has a lot of close fights. Though we can talk about how that dynamic has shifted somewhat as he has grown into a featherweight style. Since I mangled it before, I'll repeat what I said in the last segment. Their first fight, though remembered now as a close, could-have-gone either-way contest, I think, and I'm guessing you agree with me, I think it was closer to a 50-45 Aldo decision than it was a 48-47 Edgar. I think Edgar won like 1.5 rounds. And that otherwise Aldo was pretty clearly in control of the contest. Even if he wasn't doing a lot to put his stamp on it, I think the judges definitely got it right.
Yeah, even the round that Edgar won was tight, and he didn't do much in the way of actual convincing damage. So, like, Aldo still, I think, landed the hardest shots in the lone round that Edgar did win. Yeah,
but this is why I think this fight is actually so interesting. I'm a lot more interested in this fight this time around than I was the first time. Especially because the first time I was a bona fide Frankie Edgar hater, and I have come to appreciate him now as somebody who has watched all of his fights and very carefully come to understand what he does well. I was also at that time a Dominic Cruz hater, Pat, if you believe it, because I
do believe it.
Can't get enough Dominic Cruz now. I can't get enough. I watch his fights all the time. But the first fight, like I said before, Frankie Edgar, I think, was forced to fight in a certain way or felt compelled to. We talked about this a bit with Mark Henry when he came on the show. And if you guys haven't listened to that, it's a criminally under-downloaded episode. Mark Henry gave us one of the most insightful, fascinating interviews we've ever had. He's Frankie Edgar's coach. He's Edson Barboza's coach. He's also coaching Eddie Alvarez against Rafael dos Anjos, and Chris Weidman for his eventual rematch with Luke Rockhold, if now it ever happens. But Mark Henry is a brilliant, brilliant MMA coach. Really great guy with a boxing background, so you should listen to that one. But what Mark said to us, Pat, is that Frankie, at lightweight, he took a sensible approach of just basically staying as far away from everyone as possible. Because Frankie was really a small lightweight. To the point where now at featherweight, he doesn't really have a size advantage the way most fighters who move down do, so much as he just doesn't have as much of a size disadvantage. He'll still be the smaller fighter against longtime featherweight champ Jose Aldo. And so at lightweight, that size disparity, it compelled Edgar and Henry, who was coaching him, Mark Henry, to stay far away and to make the opponents chase him and set up his takedowns that way and then use those failed takedowns to set up strikes. Now Edgar, I think, has become accustomed to what it's like to be roughly the same size as his opponents. And so he's a lot more physical now. He's a lot more willing to stay close to his opponents, to take smaller steps. I think it has almost coincidentally ended up sharpening his striking abilities and his defense. He's more comfortable in the pocket now, so he's not leaping around so drastically. But also, it means that when he gets you down, Frankie Edgar's a lot meaner from top position. When he gets you in the clinch, Frankie Edgar's a lot more punishing. And when he hits you, Frankie Edgar is, like Dominic Cruz, sitting down a lot more on his strikes and staying close enough to do damage. The problem is that, like I alluded to before, how do you do that against Jose Aldo? Like, if your game plan is to hold Jose Aldo down, you're in for a rough night. And if your strategy, like Chad Mendes before Edgar, is to come into the rematch more aggressive and more effective as striker, that I kind of think that brings out a different Jose Aldo.
Yeah. So this is my question to you, Connor, and because you hit on I think the two most important things, which is that Edgar is willing to stand closer to his opponents now. He is in general more efficient with his movement and his footwork, and that he has drastically improved his top game. Those are the two big differences that Edgar has made in his game since he lost to Aldo in the last 3.5 years. Right? Fair to say?
Yeah.
We're on the same ground with that. Okay. In what way does either of those improvements change the basic dynamic of this matchup?
Well, I think it changes the striking. I mean, the real thing for Frankie Edgar, there were a lot of rounds in their first fight where he did land more strikes than Jose Aldo, and he landed some clean shots too.
In no round did he land more headshots than Aldo did.
Sure.
Not a single round.
He outkicked him in some rounds. I'm saying he did land some effective volume in their fight. He was effective.
He landed a lot of kind of glancing low kicks.
Sure.
Like I'm not disputing the basic numbers. Like if you go and you look at Fight Metric, it says some things. But with that said, even in the rounds where Edgar landed more strikes, he outlanded Aldo in the third round, right? He outlanded him by four strikes total. Of the strikes that Edgar landed in that round, 7 of them were to the legs. He got front kicked in the face, which was by far the most damaging strike of the round. Mm-hmm. I understand what you're saying. Like, I'm there with that.
He had some clean contact. He landed some good punches and some solid kicks, in addition to a lot of stuff. I mean, we both agree he lost the fight, and it's because the impact of his strikes was clearly not what Aldo's was.
Yeah, I mean, so the basic dynamic of that fight. Let me I was asking kind of a leading question here. The answer is the basic dynamic of the fight doesn't change at all, despite Edgar's improvements. Like, Aldo is still a more powerful striker. He's still the better counterpuncher. He still probably has the tighter, better footwork. He can still dictate range with his jab. And most importantly, Edgar, while maybe a little more physical, a little more willing to use that, and definitely better on top, that is not a relevant piece of this matchup, I don't think.
The top game I don't think will be much of a factor. But let me counter that a bit, what you just said. I think the more aggressive style, I think, like we looked at Dominic Cruz, Uriah Faber 2 and 3, and the ability to sit down on shots, the ability to be a little more aggressive and be more comfortable in close range, it made a big difference for Cruz. Now, granted, Faber is far gone as a fighter than Aldo is now, I assume. But we do see what kind of difference that makes for a normally evasive fighter. I think Frankie Edgar will bring that into this fight, be a little more willing to throw shots at Aldo. We have maybe a different approach. Then the other side of that is...
See, I think you're overstating the extent... I think you're overstating his willingness to stand a little bit closer and be more efficient and calling it aggression. I don't think he's much more aggressive
more
than
available
he
to counter. More available to counter.
Yeah, I think he's... he moves less, but he's able to throw as many shots. It's not that he's throwing and landing more.
Well, but Cruz doesn't really throw many more shots than he did before either. He does just better shots.
See, I think Cruz does throw more than he used
to. Okay, all right. Well, beside the point. Maybe it's a bad comparison. I think Edgar throws better shots than he used to. I think he's in better positions, and I think his shots are more impactful because his feet are set and he's closer to his opponent. He's there to hit them back when they miss. And he's a little better at making them miss in smaller increments. So what this means is that Edgar is, as a striker, I think a little more dangerous than he was the first time he fought Aldo. So some of those clean connections he made could be a little different if he starts landing those big shots. But then we have Jose Aldo, who I have to imagine, this is some assumption, this isn't concrete analysis, but I have to imagine Jose Aldo comes into this fight desperately wanting to make a statement. I have to imagine Jose Aldo comes into this fight prepared to beat the shit out of Frankie Edgar. And so I think that I think Edgar throwing more shots or being more willing to throw maybe has a better chance of hurting Aldo, but like I said in the Jedrzejczyk-Gadelha fight, probably also has a higher chance of being hurt himself. Edgar's never been a flawless defensive fighter. I think in this matchup of the two, Aldo is definitely has the better head movement and the probably still the better evasive footwork, the more efficient evasive footwork. And then we have Frankie Edgar. I don't know, man. I can see both guys being a lot more willing to fire at each other in this matchup, given what they've been through recently, given the fact that Frankie Edgar has learned to be a featherweight, and that Jose Aldo was knocked out in 13 seconds in his last fight. And I'm giving him the benefit of the doubt and assuming that he comes back okay from that and takes it as a positive spur to fight harder rather than something that kind of shakes his confidence, just because hearing Jose Aldo talk, I think he's that kind of mentally tough guy, but even that can be a mistake. In the McGregor fight, I think we most of us agree. I'm not actually sure if you agree with this, but he was a little too willing to set something up and land a big shot early, which makes sense. But we know that Aldo, he is not invulnerable to the sort of the implications of his matchups. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, I have never been on the Aldo came out. I've never been on the Aldo came out too hard against McGregor train. I think that, like, if you're fighting a guy who wants to pressure you in the first place, coming out and being the one to throw the first shot is not, it makes sound rational sense.
Sure. I agree. I agree. It's still not the kind of shot that Jose Aldo normally throws in a committed kind of committed shot Jose Aldo normally throws that early into a fight, but I do understand the thought process behind it. But still, I also think that some of that is Aldo really wants to teach Conor McGregor a lesson early. He wants to show him, I'm the featherweight kingpin. I'm the striker in this division. I'm the expert kickboxer. And bringing that mentality, now having suffered the consequences of that in his last fight, having been knocked out in 13 seconds, does Aldo come into this fight a little more aggressive? I kind of tend to believe that he will.
Yeah, well, I think that so the basic... let's come back to the basics here and flesh it out from there. The basic dynamic of Edgar and Aldo's first matchup was Aldo forcing Edgar to come after him and then countering him when he did. Right?
Sure, yeah.
He forced a guy who wanted to stick and move to stay on him because he wasn't there to be hit when Edgar wanted to land those shots. Right. Sure. So he repeatedly, over and over and over again, drew Edgar onto his counter punches, like backstepping right hands, check hooks. When Edgar did stop in front of him, then and only then did Aldo kick. And so I was a little bit unfair. I think you're right that Edgar is more aggressive than he used to be. Like, he did a good job of pressuring Uriah Faber in bursts, but I still don't think that's his default mode. And I think that he should have learned from his first fight that if he tries to pressure Aldo, he's going to walk himself right into counter after counter after counter.
So maybe it'll be kind of a bit of a staring contest, or will Aldo be the one who feels that he has to make the first move?
I think Aldo's going to be the one who comes after Edgar here. I think that the dynamics are actually going to kind of reverse themselves. That Aldo is going to want to be the one to get in Edgar's face, walk him down, be the more aggressive guy, and I don't know. So maybe that happens, or maybe it's just a complete repeat of their first fight.
So and if it is in that kind of matchup, go on.
Well, so if it is similar to their first fight, I actually think you're right. I've changed my mind on this as we've been talking. I think you're right, Connor. I think it becomes a much more of a firefight than their first one.
Yeah, but I think just Edgar hits harder, more willing to throw, and I think there has never been a fight that has impressed upon me a stronger impression, given me a stronger impression of a fighter's mentality than Aldo versus Mendes 2. Just seeing how well Jose Aldo responded to an unexpectedly and extremely competitive challenger, and how well he coped with the fact that basically the guy who was untouchable in his last 5 fights was knocked down in the first 30 seconds and staggered badly 1 or 2 other times over the course of the fight. He adjusted to that really, really well. Really had a very clever, but also a very ballsy kind of ability to stand his ground and trade when he needed to, and to, in kind of that disincentivization way, pay Mendes back every time he had some success. Like, he really cowed Mendes in that fight. Mendes came after him wanting to pressure and wanting to draw things out, and Jose Aldo changed his mind by the end of the first round to the point where Mendes couldn't do it consistently for the rest of the fight.
And that's the difficulty in pressuring Aldo if you are not a pressure fighter, if that is not your jam, if that is not your jam. Like, we've talked about this before, like how pressuring seems like the kind of thing that everybody should be able to do, and everybody should be able to do it in bursts, but pressuring over and over and over again takes a certain kind of mindset that
it's
not
pressure
every fighter
on you.
has.
It's pressure on you because you got to stand that close to them and you got to be in their face and you have to shake off all of these counters that they're throwing your way. It's a lot of pressure to be a pressure fighter.
It puts mental pressure on you as well as on the opponent.
Yes.
It creates a certain battle of wills. And so when guys do get better at pressuring over and over and over again, as we'll talk about on tomorrow's episode with regard to Daniel Cormier, I'm sure, like that is a notable thing that you need to bear in mind. Like that because it requires a change in your mentality. So like Edgar was much more willing to pressure against Uriah Faber, but Uriah Faber as a counterpuncher did not give Edgar a whole lot to think about.
He's pretty one note, and that is not Aldo. And like, it's not even just like countering single openings and things like that. It's just like going into zero fucks to give mode for like 30 seconds of extreme intensity. I remember in the first round, Mendes had knocked Aldo down once. And he had also rocked him with a few good punches, a nice, like a 3-2, I believe, right on the chin. He landed some really good shots in that round. And then Mendes poked Aldo in the eye. And Aldo had a second to rest. He didn't take as long as he could have. But he said, all right, let's resume. And like, he touched gloves with Mendes, and then he just came after him with reckless combinations. He tried to tear his head off. And very shortly after, he ended up knocking Mendes down and sealing the round for him. And that's the kind of thing, that mentality makes him a really difficult guy to deal with when you're trying to pressure him. You can't teach Aldo lessons. He's always going to teach you the last lesson. And I think that is fundamentally what makes this matchup difficult for Edgar, even if I do think that Edgar, being in more of a firefight, probably has a much better chance of winning than he did last time. Again, I think he also has a much bigger chance of losing in dramatic fashion than he did last time. He had to walk that narrow line, that razor's edge, where he was winning arguably some of the rounds and not turning Aldo into a destroyer. And this time, if he comes after him more, or if he counters more aggressively or whatever, he risks kind of initiating that more aggressive Jose Aldo. That is, again, assuming that Jose Aldo responds well or neutrally at the very least to the fact that he was just KO'd for the first time in his career against the last guy he would want to be knocked out by, I'm sure.
Yeah, so I really think in the grand scheme of things, so in terms of wanting to draw out that reaction from Jose Aldo, I think it is rational for Edgar over the course of a 5-round fight to want to draw out that Jose
early
Aldo.
To tire him out.
Yeah, because I think that you want to get Aldo into a space where he's throwing 15 or 20 strikes a minute, because there's no way that he can maintain that.
Yeah.
Over the course of a fight.
That was my idea. That's the thing, though. That was my idea for the Mendes fight. When I did a gaps in the armor piece for that fight, and I said Jose Aldo is the most tactical fighter in all of MMA. He does not think that well in terms of overall strategy. I don't think it's something that Day handles for him, that Pederneiras handles for him. But in terms of answering the beats of your attacks, beat by beat, each technique at a time, how to evade this, how to counter, there is nobody who does it better. And so the problem with fighters like that is you can draw them into your kind of fight. You know what I mean? You can give them enough things to respond to that, like, the computer of Aldo's mind becomes totally dedicated to answering what you're giving him. And so with a guy who does have a penchant for, not a penchant, but a tendency to tire and to be a burst fighter, as we said before, that can be a drawback. But the thing is Aldo is so good at making the most of those moments when he decides to teach you a lesson that it scares you off enough to give him a respite.
Yeah, so look at the statistics from that first Aldo Edgar matchup tell a really interesting story, because Frankie Edgar landed 11% of the shots he threw at Jose Aldo's head in that fight. 11%. That is an unbelievably that is an almost impossible to believe number.
It's very slim.
Conversely, while Aldo still threw and missed a lot, Aldo landed like 27 or 28% of the shots he threw to Edgar's head. So if you're Frankie Edgar, do you want to be in a firefight with Jose Aldo? Like, it may make rational sense to do that over the course of a fight, but like, what happens if you get into that exchange and you eat a clean left hook to the liver and then a straight right to the head? Like, can you still stay in that headspace? And like, as it turns out, I think the Mendes fight may not be our best guide because, as it turns out, Mendes is not like the most durable fighter in that division.
No,
right?
no.
Like, so I don't think we realized that at the time, but now I think we have a fairly good sense that
how much more durability does Frankie Edgar have in him? I have to wonder. For a guy who is vaunted as a defensive fighter, he's been in a lot of really tough firefights, had to survive a lot of really tough spots, and he's 34. Jose Aldo is still only 29. He was just knocked out, and Frankie Edgar technically never has been, but he's been close enough that probably people wouldn't have complained that hard, except for Frankie Edgar fans, if they stopped the fight. And I think those are the guys who tend to suffer more from their concussive impact, the guys who are tough enough to take it, rather than the guys who get hit clean once and go away.
Well, so these are the kinds of things that make this a really compelling fight, right? Like I don't know that I necessarily acknowledged this enough when you said it, when you've said it over the course of our discussion here, but like, Aldo did just get iced in 13 seconds.
Yeah.
Like, but conversely, the fact that Edgar just iced Chad Mendes in the first round, does that make him a little overconfident in the idea of his power and maybe exchanging with a guy like this?
It's a matchup that feels a lot more compelling because of all the different things going on almost outside of the actual performances themselves in the fighters' lives than it was the first time. The first time it was this fight where I was like, man, Frankie Edgar gets another title shot just because he's moving down to featherweight. I want to see Jose Aldo fight, blah, blah, blah. This time, Edgar has solidified himself as a very effective and notably different featherweight fighter than he was as a lightweight. Jose Aldo has just fallen a very long way from a perch that you and I both thought he wouldn't fall from. We weren't surprised to see McGregor knock him out, but we were surprised to see it happen that way. And we both of us picked him. And so this is a guy who has been at the top of his division, one of the most dominant champions in MMA history. And so we have to, these are things we can't answer as analysts, but these are questions that make this a compelling fight. These are reasons why it's so fun to discuss, because watching it, there's just going to be a lot of plot lines that need to be tied up in the course of 25 minutes or less.
Yeah. Like when these two guys fought the first time, I picked Aldo. I have never been so convinced of a guy that like dead serious. Like, if I were to make a list of all the fights I was really convinced about beforehand, like, I was convinced that Jose Aldo was going to win that fight and win it pretty much exactly the way he did, almost without getting out of second or third gear the whole fight. Like, he never had to throw it into fourth or fifth gear. He never had to pressure. He fought a calm, measured fight the whole time and had enough gas to go 2 more rounds at the end.
Sure.
Like, he easily could have done that. And so, you know, but this time I'm a lot less sure. Like, I'll give it away. I'm still picking Aldo. I still think Aldo wins, but you know, I'm a lot less convinced about that than I was the first time, because Frankie Edgar deserves a massive amount of credit for the kind of improvements he's been able to make in his game over the last few years. To have beaten the shit out of five guys in a row, to have beaten the shit out of the best in the division, to have more cleanly knocked out Chad Mendes than Conor McGregor did, by the way, to have beaten Cub Swanson the way that he did when Cub was on that great run, like to have survived easily inside Charles Oliveira's guard for the better part of 3 rounds, like Frankie Edgar is fighting on another level right now.
And effortlessly outsmart a crafty veteran like Uriah Faber. And, I think especially, too, after that Aldo fight, after the Oliveira fight, I was still not quite sold on Frankie Edgar as, like, a fight fan. I was like, oh, Frankie's still fighting down to the level of his competition. That fight was way tougher than it should have been. Frankie has really, really developed himself as a fighter. Not in huge ways. As a 34-year-old with a lot of wear and tear, there's not a ton of massive changes he's going to make, but he has achieved the mental edge I think he needs to potentially be a featherweight champion kind of fighter. He has added some nuance to his game that makes him more effective in this division. He has honed and sharpened. Those are the kinds of things that really set certain older veteran fighters apart from the rest, is that ability to adapt from one fight to the next. And So we basically have Edgar, who adapts from one fight to the next. Edgar, who has pretty much never done worse, has never done worse in a rematch than he has in the first fight of a series, ever. In fact, he's almost always won the rematch when he's fought a guy twice. And against a guy in Jose Aldo who adapts really well on the fly, but for whom there are very serious questions about where he's at right now. So I'm also picking Jose Aldo. All we have to go on are past performances. Knowing Aldo as I feel I do, as a fighter, knowing someone who's watched so many of his performances and see how he responds to the various tribulations of his career, I do believe he's the kind of guy who will respond fairly well and will come out to send a message, but is never the kind of guy who's too reckless. Barring the fact he got knocked out by Conor McGregor, even if I thought that was a little more aggressive than he was normally, that's not the kind of consequence that normally occurs between two fighters of such an elite level. A 13-second one-punch KO is a low percentage, to say the least. So I am also picking Jose Aldo. I have some questions. I'm very intrigued by this fight. But I do have to go with Scarface. I still believe in Jose, damn it. I still believe. It's still real to me. That's all I have to say about that. So next up on the docket, man, these are good fights. I'm very excited that we got to talk about that. I didn't realize until now how much I was actually looking forward to discussing it, because it's such a complicated matchup. Next up on the docket, we're going to take one more break. When we come back, we're going to discuss the UFC debut of Will Brooks, who is fighting lightweight veteran Ross Pearson. And then we're going to talk about the Korean Superboy Doo-Ha Choi, who's getting one of his first big tests against Thiago Tavares. Financial support is fantastic, but there are other, even easier ways to support Heavy Hands. Perhaps the best is by spreading the word. We know our fan base. You're all cool, popular people with serious social media presences. You're tastemakers and trendsetters. Okay, there are one or two of you that don't fit that description. You know who you are, but no matter what, you can always help us out by telling folks about the show. And you can also give us a positive rating and review on iTunes and Stitcher, things like that. We rely on word of mouth and positive feedback to grow and improve, so thank you very much for your time and your help. Now, back to the show. And we're back. Forgive me if you hear some explosions in the background. I'm not in the midst of a war zone. It's the 4th of July as we record this. That's a mistake, isn't it, Pat? We're not supposed to timestamp the recordings of these. But we don't record them that far in advance, so you'll be listening to this just after the 4th of July. But people are setting off explosives outside my apartment, so that's what that sound is if you happen to hear it.
It must be amazing to live someplace that isn't so dry that a firework would just immediately cause the entire place to explode.
Nonetheless, they are illegal here, but they're pretty much overlooked.
Yeah, no, I mean, there have been so many explosions here in my neighborhood in the recent past.
Yeah, it happens. God bless America, Pat. On that note, we're about to talk about Will Brooks, former Bellator lightweight champion, would still be the Bellator lightweight champion. He never lost that title, but left the organization to join the UFC. Very excited to see his debut. He's fighting Ross Pearson. I love this matchup. I think it's a great test for Brooks coming into the UFC, and not to tip my hand, still a very winnable matchup for him.
Yeah, no, I agree. I agree completely with that. It's going to be a matchup where Brooks can't get away with anything, right? Like,
sure.
Pearson is the kind of fighter who, at this stage in his career, is mostly there to make young guys pay for their mistakes and to put on fun fights. And Brooks is not a super young guy, though he does still have quite a bit of room to get better. But he does still have some rough edges to sand off, and that's the kind of thing where Pearson can give him problems.
Sure, yeah, absolutely. I think really the big thing in this matchup is that Will Brooks is an outfighter by trade. I think we can pretty safely say, given his recent performances, what he did against Michael Chandler, Will Brooks likes to stick to the outside. He likes to move. He likes to stay so far away that you can't hit him, and then he likes to step in and crack you when you start chasing him, and pick away with like inside leg kicks and long jabs and stuff like that from long range. And I think what that's going to do is make Ross Pearson come forward. And I think that is fundamentally a kind of fight that, against a fighter of Will Brooks' caliber, Ross Pearson cannot win.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I'll tell you exactly, and I agree with most of that, but I'll take it a step further and tell you exactly why that's going to leave Pearson in a lot of trouble, is because it's going to leave him stepping in so far that he winds up in Brooks' clinch. And
that too, yeah.
So the best part of Brooks's game isn't anything that he does. Isn't anything that he does at range, though he's a pretty good range striker. He's a really surprisingly good counterpuncher. He's a very sharp, very dangerous counterpuncher. He's a really good wrestler. He's an especially good defensive wrestler. He's a good grappler. But more than anything else, I think Brooks is an in-fighter, which is odd because he's still an out-fighter. But he wants to be all the way out or all the way in. He only wants to be in the pocket long enough to land 2 shots and either move in or move out. He does not want to be in that space for very long. But when Brooks is inside, he fights like Dustin Poirier does on steroids, which makes sense because they're like best friends and training partners. But he is unbelievably strong with a single collar tie. He throws in combination on the inside in ways that very, very few inside fighters do. He'll go from a single collar tie uppercut to move your hand down and then elbow you twice on the side of the head. And then when you move your hands back up, he pulls down on the collar tie and lands 3 knees to your sternum before going back to the elbow. He mixes his combinations up on the inside in interesting ways. He makes you react to those. He reads your reactions on the inside, and then he does a great job of throwing on his way out too. He's not one of those guys who's so desperate to be inside that he panics when you get out. He's like, oh, okay, you're leaving, so now I'm going to make you pay for leaving too.
Yes. Now the thing is, Will Brooks, despite all of that, is not a very hurtful fighter. He's not a very destructive hitter. He doesn't tend to get a lot of finishes these days. The weird one against Michael Chandler, notwithstanding, it was really just a perfect shot as Chandler was out of position and tired, because that's what happens to Michael Chandler when it's not the second round anymore. But Will Brooks is not a very impactful hitter. And I don't think he cares to do a lot of damage when he does strike. Now, I wonder, and this is something that our mutual friend Phil McKenzie brought up in the comments section of our last episode on Bloody Elbow, is how will that possibly be pretty difficult for Will Brooks going forward in the upper echelons of the UFC lightweight division. Not talking so much about the Ross Pearson fight, because in addition to all the reasons you said, I think Ross Pearson's at his worst when he comes forward, and he's still willing to do it. As a outboxer, a counterpuncher, I think he's really good. When he comes forward, he gives up a lot of his advantages. So I do think Brooks is going to win this fight, but going forward, since this is his promotional debut, does it become a problem for Will Brooks that he is not a very hard hitter, or someone who can, not a super dynamic fighter in that sense, that he can't change the momentum of a fight in an instant as reliably as other fighters? Or because he's training with a guy like Dustin Poirier, do you think he over time adds that that impactful striking, adds that hurtfulness back into his game?
So I'm of 2 minds about this, and I think that there are really a couple of different ways of looking at it. I think we have to bear in mind that we have seen him in 5-round fights for the last few years, and that affects the way that you prepare and train for these things.
Sure.
Right?
Good point.
I think that there's a chance that in a 3-round fight, the current version of Will Brooks looks a lot more, pushes a lot more devastating pace. Or conversely, that could mean that maybe 5-round fights just really suit his kind of attrition-based style, because it is attrition-based. He is, at this point, he has proven himself to be a 5-round fighter in the sense that he uses all of that time. He works your legs, he works your body. He layers his game from round to round and forces you to adapt to what he's showing you over time. He's not afraid to lose exchanges if it means that he gains a strategic edge over the course of the fight. Like early in his fight with Marcin Held, he was happy to get on the ground and let Held do his leg lock thing, because he knew he could defend the leg locks even if Held got close to finishing one, if it meant that he could force Held to burn out a ton of energy and he could beat the shit out of him from the top.
Sure.
That was a trade Brooks was happy to make. Those are the kinds of trade-offs I think that suit you a lot better in a 5-round fight than in a 3-round fight.
Absolutely, I agree.
Yeah, so there are 2 ways of looking at that, and that's either that Brooks just happens to be particularly well adapted to 5-round fights, or he has adapted his game to 5-round fights, and once we see him back in a 3-round fight, he will look substantially different.
That he won't play those kinds of gambits given only 15 minutes.
Yeah, I'm inclined to think it's the former. I think he's really just a much better 5-round fighter.
Which sucks, because what if he doesn't get back there? You know what I mean? I think Will Brooks really stands a very good chance of being the kind of fighter who could be a fairly long-term champion in this division. with that style. I think he's got the kind of game already that Jose Aldo learned to develop after tearing his way to the title, or the kind of game that John Jones developed in some senses, very much like John Jones, in fact, in the way he approaches ranges and fighting. I think you get Will Brooks fast track to the title, he could very well be a long-term champion. But if his style doesn't get him up that ladder, or if he doesn't have enough time to work his advantages against some of the really tough contenders in this division, then he may never get the chance to apply that.
Well, yeah, so he's the kind of guy who matches up on paper really well with Rafael dos Anjos and Khabib Nurmagomedov and Tony Ferguson.
Sure.
But he's also the kind of guy who could lose a 3-round fight to Edson Barboza or Nate Diaz.
He could lose a 3-round fight to any of those guys just because he loses the first round and doesn't seal the second, even if he's doing well. It's like his style is the Chandler fight, I think, is a perfect example, or the Held fight you just brought up. It's just giving the guy a chance to work and tire himself out. That is a brilliant way of thinking for long fights. And Will Brooks is the kind of fighter who would be even better if MMA title fights were 7 rounds or 9 rounds or whatever. But in 3-round, 15-minute contests, those kinds of trade-offs that make you really special and really well adapted for long fights, they're just not as valuable.
Yeah. I mean, with all of that said, I still think he beats Pearson here because Pearson is going to give Brooks enough rope to hang himself. That's, like Pearson is going to overshoot on his combinations. He's going to wind up in the clinch. He's going to get over aggressive coming forward, and he's going to eat some counters. And if he makes if he comes forward too aggressively too, Brooks is also really good at hitting reactive takedowns. And if he can get on top, Pearson isn't getting back up, and he's going to take a ton of damage because Brooks has a great top game.
Yep.
So there are enough things that Pearson doesn't do well that he's gonna get himself in trouble. I just hope that in his next fight we see Brooks in a 5-rounder, whether that's a title fight or not.
Me too. Yeah, that'd be great. Maybe a eliminator between him and Nurmagomedov or something like that. I would love to see that.
Yeah, I think he's like the only dude who can match up with Nurmagomedov in the clinch. Him and Poirier maybe.
Sure. Yeah. That's, and I think more so than Poirier. Really, I do, because of his. I think his grappling is just a little sharper, a little more dynamic than Poirier's. Okay, so our final fight to discuss today. Last week, we kind of had our undercard feature bout. We talked about the bantamweight matchup between Anthony Birchak and Delano Lopez. This week, we want to give a little shine to a fight that is not getting as much love as Jedrzejczyk, Gadelha, or the UFC debut of Will Brooks. It is, however, I think the featured prelim, and it is one that you should definitely watch. I'm talking, of course, about Choi, the Korean Superboy, versus Thiago Tavares in a featherweight feature. If you don't know who Choi is, you should go back and watch all of his fights that you can. He is a destructive puncher. 11 of his 14 wins by knockout, with 1 submission and a mere 2 decisions in there. Can I make what may sound like a weird comparison? Choi reminds me of Rory McDonald with a ton of punching power. He's kind of stiff.
You're right. That does sound odd. So
right.
by all means.
He's kind of stiff. Doesn't have great defensive skills in terms of head movement. He doesn't also have all the adaptations Rory has added, but he's very, very dangerous in the pocket. He's got great timing, and he always stays over his feet and in good position to respond with punches. He has basically all of the traits and many of the drawbacks of Rory McDonald's striking, without the grappling and stuff to back it up. Although he's not a bad grappler. He's actually a very good scrambler.
Yeah, I'm trying to think whether I agree with that or not. I don't know. I think it's hard to come up with a good analog for Choi because he's really long. He's kind of, he kind of fights like Michael McDonald, but I think he's much better from a technical perspective than Michael McDonald is. He works way faster, and he's a much better wrestler and grappler. I would say. I
mean, the thing is Choi is absolutely hittable. You can definitely hit him, and he will stand his ground and enable you to get close enough to hit him. But he's also a devilishly good combination puncher. His timing is superb. The way he strings his punches together is pretty brilliant. He can shorten or lengthen his shots on the fly, change them from uppercuts to hooks. The angles and trajectories are all very adaptable for him, and he'll pull the trigger at just the right moment to catch you coming in or to go after you. And he's always in a good position over his feet, I think, to swing, although like Rory McDonald, he's a little heavy on that front foot.
It's rare to find such a young fighter because I think he's still in his early to mid 20s who is I think he's 25 now,
He's
who is such a
25.
good counterpuncher.
Yeah. Yeah, it's true.
Like I mean, he's got really great timing. He's got really great triggers. He is just a mean motherfucker.
Yep.
And I love watching him fight. So this is an interesting matchup with Tavares because if you're not on your A game, Tavares is going to take you down and grind you out from top position and maybe try for a submission or two, but mostly he'll grind you out. And he's competent enough on the feet to keep you honest. But he's also going to give you a lot of opportunities and he doesn't have a great chin. So, like, either Choi loses a decision or he just knocks Tavares' head clean off. Just way off into the ground.
Yeah, way off into the grandstands. Tavares is one of those fighters who is he's really quite good. Tavares does a lot of things really well, but it's like he has just some of those fighters. I'm trying to think of another example who just kind of lack that one attribute that would put them over the edge. Like with Tavares, if he was more durable, if his face didn't cut up so easily, and if he wasn't so easy to hurt, he could be a top fighter in this division. Because he's very game, he throws a lot of volume, he's got great submission grappling, and he has really, really good ground and pound. I think that's one of his most underrated skills. But he was lacing Brian Ortega up with punches from top position in their fight. He's very good in all of those different phases, but he can be hurt, and he's kind of hittable, and he wears damage poorly. And so that's a big drawback for him against Duha Choi. It's hard to imagine him facing a guy who, yeah, you can hit him, but he doesn't really mind because he's going to hit you back. And I don't mean to make Choi sound like he's some kind of reckless brawler. I think he just knows that he can take your shot, and his offensive technique is really, really solid. He's almost a flawless puncher in terms of mechanics. And so how does Thiago Tavares win a fight like that? You can decision Duha Choi. If he gets him down, he can definitely control position and hurt him with strikes. That's a big advantage for him. But I'm really having trouble envisioning this fight in my head and seeing an outcome that doesn't involve Tavares walking into something and falling down.
Yeah, I mean, I fundamentally agree with that. Like, Tavares is, you know what, I think Tavares is the clearest example of our much discussed durability corollary.
Sure,
that,
yes.
like, it doesn't matter if, like, Tavares, there isn't really anything that Tavares doesn't know how to do at a better than average level. Like, and like you said, his top game is really, really good. He's a relentless chain wrestler and puts together really nice chains, especially against the cage. Like, he is, on skills, I think he is a top 8 featherweight. Like,
sure.
Maybe a little bit less than that, top 8, top 10, somewhere in there. But he's never going to crack the top 20 in any division not because he gets hit a lot, but because he goes out when you hit him.
He will always lose to some worse guys because they can take shots in a way that he can't.
Yeah, like the shots that Brian Ortega hit him with were not like life altering kill shots, you know, but they put him out. And like, you cannot be an elite fighter in any division in MMA if you can't take shots better than the average guy in your division. Definitely not worse than the average guy in your division.
Yeah, it reminds me of an interview that I did on this show way before you were even on board, Pat, with Light Burley, who is like the living legend in New York who does 52 blocks, some real gangsta boxing with the elbow blocks and shit. And he said he used the phrase, "I got a left hook that'll change your life," and that's kind of Duha Choi's edge in this fight. Is like he can take a shot pretty well, and he will land a life-altering shot on Thiago Tavares in a way that Tavares just can't absorb. He just can't afford to take that damage. So I hope it's an interesting contest. I hope Tavares gives Choi something to overcome, because I'm not sure if he's going to make the kinds of changes as a young fighter that he needs to make if he just keeps starching guys in the first round without ever really being in trouble. But I think most likely he knocks Tavares out in round 1. Seems fairly likely to me.
Yeah, I think it may take him a little longer than that, and I wouldn't be surprised if he fucked up and spent some time on his back. But I think that over the course of a 15-minute fight, the chances of Tavares walking into something are almost are like,
especially with Choi,
4-1 that he walks into something.
Yeah, especially with Choi. It's not like a normal Thiago Tavares fight. Like, he is in there against a really willing and aggressive striker with really good technique in his hands.
Yeah, like, Tavares is going to have to work against Choi in layers, right? So, like, Choi isn't just going to give him his hips and let him take him down. So that means that Tavares is going to have to do something to create a situation in which he can get Choi down, right? And that means that to do that something, to open up his takedowns, he's going to put himself in a position to get hit.
Yeah.
Like, and so that's what makes this dangerous. Is it's not like he can just grab a hold of Choi, bull him to the fence, and pull him down. Like, he's going to have to throw to get Choi throwing back to create an opportunity to get in on Choi's hips for a takedown, and that's why he's going to get knocked out.
Yep. I'm with you. I'm with you all the way on that one. So that pretty much wraps up our episode for the day. Join us again tomorrow. If you're listening to this on Tuesday, join us again tomorrow. We'll be discussing all of the most interesting and exciting fights from UFC 200. And just to give you an impression of how damn good that card is, we already got 2 of them out of the way. Lesnar Hunt on last week's episode and Aldo Edgar today. And we still have, I think, 5 fights that we're going to discuss tomorrow.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yep. So what have you written that's come out already this week, Connor?
Nothing yet this week. I have I have a Sherdog preview which has been submitted. So the UFC 200 preview, that's the only preview I'm doing. That will be coming out this week, probably on Wednesday. I have an article that will be going up on Tuesday, so same day as this, actually. Same day as this episode. And that will be on Jose Aldo and Joanna Jedrzejczyk, the sort of evolved sprawl and brawl style, and how they make their kickboxing so effective against opponents who almost invariably really want them on their backs. And then later this week, I'm going to have 2 articles coming out, one on Cormier Jones, one on... Well, both on that fight. One on beating Cormier, one on beating Jones. And then... other stuff, 2 vivisections this week, 2 episodes of Heavy Hands. I'll be on the Sherdog Roundtable. There's just a lot of shit going on. I will reiterate, Pat, I'm really, really looking forward to sitting down and watching these fights. And now I feel bad because I just reminded myself that you won't be doing it.
I'm so sorry. It's okay. I'm just crying a little bit. Don't worry about it.
I didn't mean to rub it in.
Paroxysms you sent me into here, Connor. I understand. It's okay. It's all right. No, I'm really stoked about this. I have the piece I'm happiest with. I've got a whole bunch of complete breakdowns and previews and all sorts of shit. But I did an interview with Daniel Cormier last week, and I wrote about it's really interesting, having talked to Cormier, that he really has no illusions about what Jones has to offer him. Like, he's got a really firm understanding of what Jones is going to try to do to him and what he's going to try to do back, and the dynamics of the fight. And so it was interesting psychologically to talk to Cormier and hear him talk about that, because it's just weird to have a fighter who is in no way fooling themselves about their matchup, you know?
Sure,
and he talked about the importance of being honest with himself and objectively evaluating Jones and what he did well. So that's up on Bleacher Report right now, awesome. Creatively entitled Daniel Cormier has no illusions about John Jones. So,
that works. Those are the kind of titles that get people to read the pieces that are worth reading. I'm not good at titling pieces, Pat. All my titles are like really flowery and elusive or something like that, and people just don't give a shit. they want me to say like how Conor McGregor beat Jose Aldo. They don't want me to say like the unfurling flag or some fancy shit, which is what I always want to come up with.
Yeah, dude, it's headline writing sucks. Don't like doing it. Yeah.
This is why I'm going to transition into fiction someday, where I can title my books any damn thing I want.
Yeah, absolutely. And there too, maybe there people will be more inclined to read our stuff, man.
Maybe I'll title my first book "How the Protagonists Beat the Bad Guy." What do you think?
See, I would read that. I would read that.
It's pretty good. It's pretty good. It'll draw them in BuzzFeed style. So is that all you got coming out, or that's all you want to talk about at the moment?
I'll give a full list tomorrow.
Okay. All right. Fantastic. Final reminder to you guys, UFC 200 is of course around the corner. We're really excited to talk about it on tomorrow's episode. Episode 113, I think that'll be. Ooh, is that unlucky? But to get us ready for that, Pat and I spent 2.25 hours watching and doing alternate commentary for UFC 100, the landmark event for the UFC, which featured Brock Lesnar versus Frank Mir 2 and George St. Pierre versus Thiago Alves. Both great fights. Other fantastic fights in that card. Also, Michael Bisping's momentous knockout defeat at the right hand of Dan Henderson. It was really fun. We talk about the 4 interesting fights from that, and we skip John Fitch versus Paulo Thiago to avoid coming down from the high that is Brock Lesnar's victory. And you can find that at heavyhandspodcast.bandcamp.com. So go check that out. You can buy it for $3. For some high-quality downloads and everything. We appreciate the support. Get yourself ready for the big event coming this weekend by watching one of the best events in MMA history and join us as we commentate on it. It was a lot of fun to do. The more of you guys that listen to it, the more our chances of doing more of them in the future. And I think, Pat, both you and I would really like to do that, because I had a good time.
Yeah, it was a tremendous amount of fun. I would not at all mind doing it again.
And that pretty much is it, right? We've talked about some good fights. We have more great fights around the corner. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. If you came here today for the finer points of face punching, you came to the right place. This has been Heavy Hands.